Floor is open. I can't believe they answered all your questions. Yes. Go to the standing mic back there, and we've also got traveling mics. Please identify yourself and then fire away.
Well, this would have been a question for Jake, but he's left, so I think I'll address it to Gary. I'm Tim Richards with General Electric. When Jake was talking about the ways in which you could avoid, if you were an importer, ways you could avoid being subject to border adjustments, he talked about sectors and countries. But if you think of it from a company perspective, what you have control over is your supply chain. And so companies can actually require their suppliers to meet certain standards. But it seems as if the way this legislation is structured, there's absolutely no incentive for a company to do that, because were you to do it, then you would pay first when you actually require your suppliers to raise their costs and to impose more environmentally appropriate measures. And then you would pay second because you would still be subject to the border measures. So I was wondering whether any of you are aware of any active thinking on the Hill that would address this issue or have any further comments on that aspect.
Well, I'm going to leave the question of whether there's active thinking on the Hill to James. But you've raised a very, very important question, and I think a related question or a precursor is how far back do you go on the supply chain? And I suppose the Indian and Chinese negotiators are alert and able, and probably they're opening gambit. You'll go right back to the worker who drives his SUV to work, or the building he lives in, what Fred was talking about earlier, his home, the office building, and so forth. So you encompass an awful lot, and that gives the U.S. a tremendous carbon footprint for every product, as gives Europe and Japan likewise a high footprint. And so I would say the point you make is entirely legitimate, and I think it requires a related negotiation as to just how far the supply chain legitimately goes back, and having some reasonable cutoffs and not going to these extremes which I've just identified.
I know Jake came prepared to answer this question because we talked about it a little bit over the weekend. So I think one thing I might like to ask Gary is my understanding is in the WTO there are there's a shrimp turtle case where you have individual fishermen who meet the standard, aren't necessarily subject to the restriction under it, and which, if the country they hailed from is subject to that. So that's maybe an exception in the context of WTO. I think the legislation, I think the way that it was drafted, it actually leaves some measure of discretion to the administration in implementing it. And so I think an exception to individual cases could be made, and maybe I may be off base, but I think that's right. But I think it's certainly an important point. And WRI is part of U.S. CAP, as I know GE is as well, and this issue started to bubble up again, of course, in those discussions because, obviously, of the difficulty of the issue. So on the Hill, I'm not aware of any specific discussion of this issue, but as I mentioned, Senator Brown is currently drafting some sort of a comprehensive piece of legislation to look at all these issues. So I'm sure they'd be receptive to this concern.
Yeah, Dick Smith. In 1990, when we did the amendments and adjustments to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, we did include in that negotiation a trade provision which provided for the banning of trade in chlorofluorocarbons or other ozone-depleting chemicals, either from countries that were members of the agreement or other countries that weren't, but didn't have similar measures for reducing the impact and emissions of these chemicals. I'm not sure, because I haven't been following it lately, whether that was ever tested or whether that is provide some sort of a precedent for some of the things we're thinking about here. I wondered if you did.
Dick, while you're at the microphone, could I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because I was told that when that chlorofluorocarbons treaty was negotiated, Montreal Protocol, that the Koreans indicated they would not sign, and if others retaliated against them, they would take the case to the WTO, or the GATT as it was then. But they were told in no uncertain terms not to do that, and they complied and signed the protocol. Now, is that a correct?
I didn't tell them that. I'm not aware that happened, but it might have. I don't know. There might have been some side discussions.
Maybe an apocryphal story, but it's
I'm not aware of it.
You're not aware.
happened.
Okay. Anyway, the question to you guys.
Well, it's a good question, Dick, and no, it was never taken to the WTO, never litigated. In the diamond case, conflict diamonds and all that, there was a waiver passed by the WTO, and there's some pretty good legal argumentation that the waiver was superfluous because the conflict diamonds had been passed by the Security Council, which arguably takes precedence over the WTO. So that's a nice legal debate, but again, that was never litigated. This interaction between multilateral environmental agreements and WTO, this is kind of an untested space. Now, in the shrimp turtle case, which was referred to, and Barry Carter was shaking his head when it was said that there were individual exceptions, and that's my recollection, there were not individual boat exceptions. Some of the proponents of pretty aggressive U.S. legislation have leaned heavily on the shrimp turtle case. I think that's inappropriate for two reasons. First of all, stare decisis in its strict form does not apply to the WTO. But secondly, and much more important, shrimp and turtles, they're important, but they're not as important as climate. I mean, it's a small case compared to this big issue of climate. So I think the appellate body would look at it afresh. And thirdly, they did give the U.S. a pass partly because the U.S. went out and negotiated with a few countries, not very many. But would they give a pass in the future if the U.S., put on some measures and got, 6 countries to agree, or kind of like-minded countries to the U.S.? I think that's a lot more questionable than it was in the shrimp turtle episode.
James, you want to add anything? No? Okay, Uri?
Yes, with a question for Gary. The issue of the level playing field is, of course, applicable in many other areas. Environmental standards, labor standards that were rejected as negotiating items in the current Doha drafts. And I guess my question is twofold. What is the difference, or conceptual or political, between the asking for level playing field and offsets, etc., and environment, labor, and in climate change? And why are we going so much further in this particular area? Just some interpretation there. And if you do, then does this mean that now we are also going to start doing or talking about offsets, direct offsets for higher labor standards, all sorts of other overheads that affect differences between developing and industrial countries?
Well, Yuri, as you well know as well as anybody, the shrimp turtle case did breach this production process and methods line, which had been previously established in the WTO, but they backed away from it in shrimp turtle. And now the question is, how far are they going to back away going forward? I don't think the conceptual difference is so great. However, there is maybe one important conceptual difference, and that is that climate change is the classic public good or public bad, which everybody contributes to, and how do you allocate the cost, and what do you do to kind of marshal up in an equitable way everybody to contribute to that, which I think is somewhat different, in fact quite different than the labor standards area. However, the main difference between the labor standards and the climate is clearly the political mood. Clearly the political mood is to act on climate, and there's no political mood, I would say even in this country, to in some sense have a uniform or a closer to uniform set of labor standards globally. We made some small steps in the Peru Agreement and NAFTA, obviously, but I mean those are really small steps compared to what we're talking about in the climate area.
I wouldn't add too much. I think the commons argument, the fact that everybody on the planet has to, shares the climate, and the implications of carbon leakage are pretty vast. Their emissions from industrial sectors around the world amount to 30 to 40% of all global emissions. This is very substantial, and if we impose carbon policy on our own industries, and those essentially they flee and begin producing the same products elsewhere under an uncontrolled situation, certainly everybody suffers as a result of that in terms of the climate impacts.
I'd like to ask you all, and maybe people in the audience, kind of big picture question. Prior to the serious launch of the negotiations en route to Copenhagen, most of the rest of the world had said, we want to see that the U.S. is serious by seeing the Congress pass legislation that will commit the U.S. to action in this area. Well, I had always worried about that, I must say, out of fear that if the U.S. did pass legislation before there was an international agreement, there wouldn't be much to negotiate about internationally, because the U.S. delegation would hand copies of the legislation around and say, here's our position, and please accommodate. Now that the rest of the world is seeing what U.S. legislation might look like, particularly in this area, what is the dynamic? Has the notion changed around the world that they want U.S. legislation first? Or do they still feel that the right kind of U.S. legislation is a sine qua non for serious action at the international level? Or do they simply hide behind the lack of such agreement, such legislation here, as an excuse not to act? What is the dynamic now between the domestic front here and the international front as this interaction that we're talking about here picks up speed quite substantially?
Well, I do wish Jake was here.
Either of you have a sense, or does anybody, Jeff Schott has a sense, and Dick Smith, and anybody else? I'm looking at Frank Loy. Frank got us into this in Kyoto. Frank, why don't you start? Go ahead to the microphone.
What you describe is obviously a dilemma, and it's a real dilemma. But I think if you ask the question, what does the rest of the world want? What it doesn't want, I think, is a repeat of Kyoto, where the United States stepped up to the plate, made a significant quantitative commitment that had little backing at home, and no chance easily, and at the time was really not implementable. I think had we not changed administrations, we don't know how that would have worked out over time, but it certainly was a somewhat empty promise, and I don't think they want that again. So on balance, my sense is it would be better if we had legislation before we had international negotiations, even though the risk you describe is very real. There would be bitching and whining. There would be anger. But at least you would have a base from which to operate. You could even have promises of seeking amendments to the legislation if necessary. It would just be an easier negotiation all the way around, and it would have the chance of going further. If you don't have that, what the United States can agree to is, I think, principles and modalities and incremental steps, but not nearly as much as the rest of the international community would want.
Okay, Dick, while you're back there, and then Jeff.
I just say from my experience in negotiating these kinds of agreements, what's looked for is U.S. leadership. It was true in the Montreal Protocol, where it was our manning of CFCs in aerosols that provided, before other countries did, that provided that leadership. Other countries are suspicious of us, I think rightly, that if we try to lead our domestic movement with an international negotiation, it doesn't usually work. The Congress won't go along. So they're very leery. I don't know that we have to have legislation in place, but we better have some bills that are looking pretty promising. They really need to see, and I think it's true in this case as it has been in a number of others that I could mention, they need to see some real indication that the United States is ready to lead and move, or they're not ready to move. So I think that kind of leadership is essential.
Jeff?
Well, I would just build on what Frank and Dick just said. There's one difference, though. In the past, the international community was looking for a concrete action in a very short period of time. And today, in terms of dealing with climate change issues, we need sustained action over a long period of time. And so the Congress could pass legislation with lots of provisions down the road about how you subsidize and give free allocations. That could all be changed in subsequent legislation, depending on what happens. And indeed, that was what James was talking about in his presentation. The key, I think, here is not the commitment to a goal of reducing greenhouse gases, but how you share the burden of that, both within countries and between countries. And that boils down in large measure to what the United States and China, as the two major emitters, are willing to do. And so the work that Trevor has begun, that Fred mentioned at the beginning, I think is very critical. Unless the United States and China can agree to a system of carrots and sticks that can be incorporated as the guiding principle of an international agreement, it's not going to work. And right now, the Congress is only interested in sticks, and the thought of providing carrots for clean development projects in China, I don't think would go over very well in the Congress. That's the political dilemma I think we find, and the idea that Gary is putting forward of sort of having iterative process between the climate negotiations and the trade negotiations to try to constrain abuses, I think is the pragmatic way to go. But we do have a big political challenge, and it's centered on the U.S.-China relationship.
Sounds like we need a G2. Anybody else? Further questions or comments? If not, let me thank our speakers today, James, Jake in absence, and Gary. Thank, again, our compatriots at WRI for the close cooperation on this whole project. Thank our friends at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for supporting the effort. Thank all of you for coming. I'm sure we're going to have more sessions on this. And do come next Wednesday, the 23rd, if you're interested in building efficiency and how to deal with that part of the climate change issue. Meeting adjourned.